I froze the moment Dad slid the papers across the mahogany desk. My brother Cole sat beside him, grinning like he had just won something he had chased his entire life. My wine glass trembled and I set it down before anyone noticed. "It's all yours now, son," Dad said, leaning back with the satisfied expression of a man who had just solved something difficult. Cole's grin stretched wider. He didn't even glance at me. "My name is Kate Harper. I am 34 years old. For 12 years I have quietly managed the financial operations of Harper Family Holdings, the company my grandfather built from nothing. I negotiated contracts. I prevented lawsuits. I kept the books balanced through 3 market downturns while my brother traveled and called it networking. Now I was watching my father hand Cole everything. The estate, the shares, the trust. As though my 12 years were background noise, he had finally decided to switch off. My jaw tightened. The rage was real. The heartbreak was real. But the calm I wore over both of them. That was the most real thing in the room. Because what neither of them knew was this: I had already seen every page of those documents 6 days ago. And I had already decided what I was going to do. Nobody spoke for a moment after the signing. Cole picked up the folder like it already belonged to him. He flipped through the pages with the casual ease of someone who has never doubted the world will arrange itself in his favor. Dad watched me carefully. He was waiting for a reaction. Tears, maybe. Or sharp, trembling anger that would confirm every quiet assumption he had made about me. I gave him nothing. I smiled instead. Not a performance. A decision. Because what neither of them understood was that I had already seen this coming. 5 days earlier, I had found the draft transfer documents in Dad's home office while retrieving a file he had asked me to pull. I read every page. I photographed every clause. I cross-referenced every figure against the trust records I had memorized over a decade of work. By the time Dad slid those papers across the desk, I already knew exactly what they said. I also knew something they didn't. The transfer had not yet been filed with the estate office. Nothing was legally complete. Nothing was permanent. The window was still open. I sipped my wine and smiled at my father over the rim of the glass, hiding everything I had already set in motion. I have been the responsible one my entire life. Not because anyone asked, but because I understood, very early, that our family had room for only one celebrated child, and Cole had claimed that position the moment he was born. He got the trophies, the stories at dinner, the warmth of Dad's full attention. When Cole did well on a test, Dad framed the paper. When I topped my class 2 years running, Dad nodded and said, "Good girl. Keep it up." I kept it up. For 34 years. Mom used to sit with me in the kitchen after those dinners, making tea, saying nothing for a while. Then she would squeeze my hand and say, "Kate, your father loves you. He just shows it differently." I believed that for a long time. But she was also the one who sat me down at 19 and said, "Document everything, sweetheart. Verbal promises mean nothing. Paper means everything." She had been talking about business. She had seen something in my father even then that I was only beginning to recognize. She passed away 7 years ago. She never saw how right she was. Standing in that study watching Cole flip through the papers, I finally understood everything she had been trying to prepare me for. I stayed for another hour after the papers were signed. I poured Dad a second glass of wine and listened to Cole describe his plans for the estate, vague, expensive ideas involving investors whose credibility I doubted. I nodded in the right places and laughed once at a joke that wasn't funny. All the while I was watching. Cole kept glancing at his phone, already celebrating something not yet fully real. I knew this because I had called the attorney's office 3 days earlier, confirming the status of any pending amendments to the trust. There were none on file. The transfer Dad believed was complete was legally incomplete. The formal amendment still needed to be filed. And as a named beneficiary of the original trust, confirmed by Bernard Okafor, my mother's longtime attorney, my written consent was required before any amendment could be executed. That consent had never been requested. Nobody had told me consent was even needed. They had assumed I would simply accept what they decided, the way I had always accepted things quietly. That assumption was going to cost them everything. I sipped my tea and smiled at my father over the rim of the cup, letting him believe the evening had gone exactly as planned. The moment I got home, I went straight to my desk. 12 years managing Harper Family Holdings had made me methodical in ways my father and brother would never appreciate, because the work that keeps a company running is invisible until it stops. I opened the drawer where I kept physical copies of everything important. Not digital files. Physical paper in labeled folders, the way Mom had taught me. The habit had seemed old-fashioned when I was younger. Now it felt like armor. I pulled out the original trust documents. The version executed 14 years ago when Grandfather was alive. The first amendment filed 7 years later. The letter Dad had written me at 30, handwritten, in which he used the words equally divided between my children when referencing the estate. I had kept that letter in a clear protective sleeve. Not folded. Not creased. Because Mom's voice had been in my head the day I received it. Document everything. Then I pulled out the bank statements I had photographed. The draft transfer documents. A folder of emails printed over the past year whenever something felt wrong. I laid everything across the desk and studied it. Then I called Bernard Okafor. He had been my mother's attorney for 15 years. He would know exactly what this meant. Bernard called back at 7:45 the next morning. "Kate," he said. "Talk to me." I laid out everything. The meeting. The papers. The draft transfer I had photographed. The letter from my 30th birthday. The original trust documents. Bernard was completely still while I spoke, letting the full picture form before responding. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. "The handwritten letter is significant," he said. "Not binding alone, but meaningful. More important is the original trust structure. Your grandfather established equal distribution provisions. Your father cannot override a foundational provision without a formal amendment process requiring beneficiary consent." "Has that process been completed?" he asked. "Not as of 4 days ago," I said. "I confirmed with the estate office directly." "Then nothing is finalized," Bernard said. "If your father attempts to finalize it in a way that contradicts the original provisions, you have legal grounds to challenge." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in a week. "The original trust contains a foundational equity clause," he continued. "It requires written consent from all named beneficiaries before any amendment affecting distribution can be executed. You are a named beneficiary." "They never asked for my consent," I said. "No," Bernard confirmed. "They did not." "Tell me what I need to do," I said. The next 10 days were quiet on the surface and entirely the opposite underneath. I continued going to the office. I managed accounts, reviewed contracts, answered emails that kept the company running while Dad attended lunches and Cole introduced himself as the incoming principal. I said nothing about it. What I did instead was plant the quietest possible seeds of doubt. At a family brunch that Sunday, Cole arrived late and launched into a story about a development partner. Dad listened with full attention. I waited for a natural pause. Then I said casually, "Dad, did you sort out the trust amendment timeline with the estate office? I noticed a few clauses in Grandfather's original provisions that might need clarification." Cole's fork stopped midway to his mouth. Dad's eyes moved to me slowly. "It's all being handled," he said. "Of course," I said, smiling. "I just want to make sure everything is airtight. You know how I am." He did know how I was. That was precisely what was beginning to concern him. I let the comment sit, just long enough to take root, then changed the subject entirely and asked Cole about his renovation ideas with what I hoped looked like genuine curiosity. His relaxed answer told me he still wasn't worried. That would change. I was careful not to move too fast. That had always been the difference between Cole and me. He wanted everything immediately. I had learned, partly from watching him, partly from watching my father, that urgency was the fastest way to lose something you were trying to protect. I moved slowly. I documented more. I organized what Bernard and I had assembled into a clear, sequential picture that could be presented without emotion or drama. I also began speaking carefully to people on the edges of the family. Not about the inheritance directly. but about what extended family members remembered of my grandfather's intentions for the estate. My Aunt Patricia, who had been present when grandfather signed the original trust, mentioned during a phone call that she had always understood the estate would pass equally. "Your grandfather told me himself," she said. I asked if she would write that down for a family history project. She said yes without hesitation. Every conversation, every document, every quiet confirmation was another plank in a floor that Cole and my father were walking across without knowing it was being built beneath their feet. Their confidence remained completely intact. That was exactly how I needed it. The less they suspected, the more freely I could work. And I was working constantly. Cole invited me to dinner 3 weeks after the meeting in Dad's study. I accepted. Not because I wanted to sit across from his satisfaction, but because watching someone who underestimates you is one of the most useful things you can do. Every conversation he didn't know was research was one I controlled. He chose an expensive restaurant, talked loudly about his plans for the estate, and referred to himself as the future of the Harper name 4 times. I counted. Without intending to, he confirmed 2 things I had suspected. First, he had already approached a development firm about the estate property before the trust amendment had been filed. He was operating on the assumption that the transfer was legally complete when it was not. Second, he had not read the original trust document. He had seen only what Dad had shown him. He didn't know the foundational equity clause existed. He didn't know his assumed victory depended on a document he had never opened. His arrogance had made him incurious. His incuriosity had made him careless. I poured him another glass of wine and asked about his development contacts with what I hoped looked like genuine enthusiasm. He talked for nearly an hour. I learned everything I needed and gave away nothing. Bernard called on a Tuesday morning with news that changed the shape of everything. He had completed a full review of all trust documents, every version, every amendment, all correspondence between my father's legal team and the original estate attorneys. The original trust contained a foundational equity clause specifying that all assets within the Harper family trust were to be distributed equally among the grantor's grandchildren, meaning Cole and me. Any amendment required the written consent of both named beneficiaries. I was a named beneficiary. No one had asked for my consent. No one had informed me it was required. My father's attorneys had either missed this or chosen to proceed without it. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after Bernard finished. "So the transfer as drafted is not legally executable," I said slowly. "Not as drafted," Bernard confirmed. "Not without your written agreement, which was never requested." I looked out my window at the street below. "Good," I said. "Let's make sure it stays that way until I decide what to do with that fact." Bernard was quiet briefly. "Kate, you have a very strong case." "I know," I said. "I've known for a while now. There is a particular kind of power that comes from knowing something no one else knows you know. It does not announce itself. It simply sits inside you, steady and warm, while the world around you operates on assumptions that are quietly and completely wrong. I had felt glimpses of this before, in contract negotiations, in boardroom conversations where I had prepared more thoroughly than anyone else present. But this was different. This was 34 years of being overlooked, underestimated, and quietly dismissed, discovering that all of it had produced exactly the kind of person my father and brother were entirely unprepared to face. I met with Bernard every week. We built the case methodically. The original trust provisions. The equity clause. The supporting materials, the letter from my father, the statement from Aunt Patricia, the correspondence showing no consent request had ever been issued to me. I did not rush. I did not leak anything. I continued going to the office. I kept the company running. I continued smiling at family dinners, pouring wine, asking Cole about his plans with warm curiosity. The floor was nearly finished. Soon it would be time to let them walk onto it. And when they did, there would be nowhere for either of them to go. Dad called on a Thursday evening, which was unusual. He typically communicated through the office. His voice was lighter than normal, which told me he was trying to keep things easy. "Just checking in," he said. "Everything all right?" "Everything's fine," I said. "I've been reading about estate planning. Interesting area." A brief pause. Oh. Just general knowledge, I said. I came across material about foundational trust clauses, the kind requiring beneficiary consent before amendments can be executed. Fascinating how often those get overlooked. The pause that followed was slightly longer. I'm sure our attorneys have everything in order, he said finally. I'm sure too, I agreed. I let the silence sit, not uncomfortably long, just long enough for something to find the soil it needed. Anyway, I said, I'm happy to help with anything operational while the transition is being sorted. You know I'm always here. I know, he said quietly. We said goodnight and I sat for a while afterward, turning the conversation over carefully. He had not been calling to check on me. He had been calling because something small and unnameable had begun working its way beneath his certainty. He was starting to feel the floor move. The extended family had begun to talk. I had not engineered this directly. I had simply been honest, in careful measured ways, with people who had been present for the history of the Harper estate, people who loved my grandfather and had their own understanding of what the trust was meant to represent. Aunt Patricia had mentioned our conversation to two of her sisters. Those sisters had their own memories, their own quiet surprise at what my father appeared to be attempting. The conversation spread the way family conversations do, not through announcements, but through the steady current of people talking to people they trust. By the time Dad heard about it, the version reaching him had traveled through enough hands to arrive without a traceable source. Just a generalized unease among relatives who had assumed the estate would pass as grandfather had written it. My father valued his reputation above almost everything else. The idea that his decision might be seen as unfair, not just legally but morally, by the family he considered his audience, was something he could not easily dismiss. Cole noticed the shift. He called me that weekend, his voice carrying a slightly different quality. Everything good? He asked. Perfect, I said. You? He didn't answer directly. That told me enough. I scheduled what I described to my father's accountant as a routine financial review. This was not unusual. I had conducted these reviews regularly for years. Arthur, who had worked with Harper Family Holdings for 9 years, had no reason to suspect anything beyond standard procedure. During the review, I identified 3 allocation discrepancies in the subsidiary accounts. 2 were minor. 1 was not. I corrected all 3, documenting each with a formal memo referencing the relevant trust provisions and original estate guidelines. Purely technical. No emotion. No implication. Just accuracy. When Arthur reviewed the corrections, his expression shifted. I wasn't aware of this provision, he said quietly, studying the trust language I had attached. It's in the foundational documents, I said calmly. Easy to miss if you're working from the amended versions without checking against the original. He nodded slowly. I'll flag this for the senior file. That's exactly right, I said. I thanked him and walked out without hurrying. The correction had been real. The discrepancy had been real. But the conversation had also planted something, the knowledge, now documented in the senior file, that the original trust contained language the amended versions had not honored. Arthur was meticulous. He would not let it sit. I was counting on exactly that. Cole came to my office unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon. He walked with the confidence of someone not yet given a reason to slow down. But his eyes, when he sat across from me, were doing something I had not seen before. They were working. What are you doing, Kate? He asked. Not aggressively. Carefully. What do you mean? I said, not looking up from the document I was reviewing. The financial review. The stuff with Arthur. The conversations apparently happening around the family. I set the document down. I conduct financial reviews every quarter, Cole. You know that. You also mentioned trust clauses to Dad last week. I mentioned I'd been reading about estate planning, I said. We talked for 5 minutes. He studied me. I kept my expression open, mildly curious, unbothered. I just want to make sure nothing complicated is happening, he said finally. I looked at him, my brother, who had spent 30 years accepting every advantage offered without once examining why it came so easily. Everything is fine, I said. And I smiled. How are the development plans coming along? His jaw shifted. He didn't answer. He left shortly after, and I watched him go with the quiet certainty that the ground beneath him had just moved again without him understanding why. Bernard and I met on a Friday morning and he laid everything on the table. The case was complete. Every piece of evidence assembled and reviewed. The original trust with the foundational equity clause. My grandfather's intentions documented across 12 years of correspondence. The letter from my father. The statement from Aunt Patricia. The financial review memo Arthur had filed. Confirmation that no consent request had ever been issued to me. Bernard walked me through it piece by piece, without drama, letting the evidence speak for itself. This is airtight, he said when he finished. Could it be challenged? I asked. Everything can be challenged, he said. But your father's team would be challenging a foundational provision written by the original grantor, contradicted by his own prior correspondence, unsupported by the required beneficiary consent, and flagged in the company's financial records. He paused. They would not win. I sat for a moment as the weight settled. This had not been a reaction. It had been a construction, built carefully over weeks of quiet, deliberate work, using every tool my mother had taught me to reach for. What's the next step? I asked. Bernard straightened the papers. We give your father one opportunity to correct this himself, he said, before we take it beyond this room. I called Dad and asked if I could come by the house on Saturday morning. His voice when he agreed carried something I had not heard before. Not quite fear, my father did not do fear openly, but something close. The awareness, perhaps, that the calm I had been maintaining was not what it appeared to be. I arrived at 9. The house smelled of coffee and old wood. Dad was in the kitchen. Cole was not there. I had timed it that way. We sat at the kitchen table and neither of us spoke for a while. Dad looked older in the morning light than he had in his study the night he signed those papers. I've been thinking about the trust, I said finally. He set down his mug. I know you have, he said. You know about the equity clause, I said. Not a question. A long pause. My attorney mentioned a provision that may need reviewing. It does, I said gently. And I'd like to resolve this without the courts. I think we can. But I need you to be honest with me. Not about the money. About why. He looked up. Just a tired man who had made a choice he was beginning to understand could not hold. I waited. He talked for almost an hour. It was not the conversation I had imagined. I had expected resistance, deflection, familiar stubbornness. Instead came something quieter and harder to receive. A slow, reluctant honesty that arrived the way truth does in people who have avoided it too long, with visible effort and very little elegance. He said he had always believed Cole needed more protection. That Cole was less structured, more likely to struggle without a clear foundation beneath him. The decision had come from wanting to ensure the estate wasn't divided between two people with different approaches. He did not say he had underestimated me, but the entire conversation was built on that foundation. Dad, I said when he finished, everything you just described as a reason to give Cole the estate is actually a reason to keep me involved. I've been managing this company for 12 years. I know every account, every contract, every provision. Removing me doesn't protect the estate. It exposes it. He was quiet for a long time. I know, he said finally. I know you do, I said. That's why I came here instead of going straight to a judge. The kitchen was still around us. Outside a bird landed briefly on the ledge and was gone. He nodded once. Slowly. The week that followed was the most delicate of the entire process. My father met with his attorneys 3 times. Bernard monitored the estate office filings, as he was entitled to do on my behalf. Each meeting was logged. No new amendments were filed. No corrective action taken. He was suspended in the uncertainty I had created. I let him stay there, because the discomfort of that suspension was doing more work than any legal document could alone. Cole called me twice. I took the first call and kept it brief, warm, unremarkable, giving him nothing to examine. I did not take the second. Not out of strategy. Simply because I did not have the energy that evening to perform being fine. Instead, I sat with the original trust documents, not the legal strategy versions, but the actual originals, and read them the way you read something that matters. My grandfather had been precise and deliberate. He had written equal distribution not because he couldn't imagine another arrangement, but because he had decided fairness was worth putting into writing. He had known, I think, that someone would need those words one day. He had been right. I folded the documents carefully and put them back in the sleeve. Arthur called on a Thursday morning. His voice carried the careful quality precise men develop when they have found something creating professional obligation. "Kate," he said, "I've completed the flagged review. There are 2 provisions in the original trust the current draft amendment fails to address. I've prepared a formal memo for the senior file and copied the estate attorneys." "Thank you, Arthur," I said. "That's exactly right." "There's something else," he said. "Your father's attorneys called after receiving the memo. They asked whether you had requested the review." "What did you tell them?" "That it was standard quarterly procedure," he said. "Which it was." "Thank you," I said again. He paused. "Kate, I've worked with this family for 9 years. Your grandfather built something worth protecting." "He did," I said. "I hope it gets protected properly," he said, and hung up in the same measured tone he applied to everything. I sat a moment with the phone in my hand. The memo was now in the senior file, copied to the estate attorneys, documented and dated. The discrepancy was no longer something Dad could quietly resolve between himself and his legal team. It was on record. Visible. Real in the way only written things are real. The case had left Bernard's office. It was moving on its own. Dad called that evening. His voice had changed, not the wariness of the Saturday kitchen conversation, not the old confidence of the study. Something newer. The quality a voice acquires when someone has accepted something they cannot change and is learning how to carry it forward. "I've spoken to my attorneys," he said. "I know," I said. A pause. "I want to do this correctly. I want to revisit the trust and make sure it reflects what it should." I breathed carefully. "I think that's the right decision, Dad." "I'm not saying I was wrong about Cole," he added, the last defensible ground, held firmly even while everything around it had quietly given way. "You don't have to," I said. "Cole can still have a role. I've never wanted to take anything from him. I've only ever wanted what was mine." A long silence. Outside my window, the city made its ordinary sounds. "Your mother always said you were the one I needed to pay closer attention to," he said finally. There was something in his voice I might have called admiration, if I hadn't spent 34 years learning not to reach for that word too quickly where my father was concerned. "She was right about most things," I said. "Yes," he said quietly. "She was." Cole came to see me again. This time he called first. He arrived on a Sunday evening and was different from the man who had sat beside Dad grinning at his own good fortune. The confidence was still present. Cole would never fully lose it, but it was quieter, more considered. We talked for 2 hours. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. He said he had known, somewhere underneath everything, that what Dad had done wasn't entirely right. He had accepted it because accepting things that were given had always been easier than examining them. He admitted he had not thought about what it meant for me, and I believed him. In curiosity about other people's experience is not the same as cruelty. I told him I didn't want his removal. I wanted what grandfather had intended. Equal standing. Equal responsibility. Equal recognition. Cole was quiet for a long time. "I've never read the original trust documents," he said finally. "I know," I said. He looked at me with something new in his expression. Not quite respect, not yet. But the beginning of it. The first opening of a door that had been closed his entire life. "You've known all of this for a long time," he said. "Long enough," I said. The formal legal review took 3 weeks. Bernard worked with my father's attorneys and the estate office to conduct a complete audit of the Harper Family Trust against its original foundational provisions. I was present at 2 of the 3 review sessions. My right as a named beneficiary, a right no one had mentioned to me before I mentioned it myself. The findings were exactly what Bernard and I had known they would be. The original equity clause was valid and enforceable. The draft amendment was not legally complete without my written consent. The financial corrections Arthur had documented supported the broader picture of a trust improperly administered in several ways, all pointing in the same direction. When the review was presented formally, with all parties present, my father's lead attorney summarized it with the practice neutrality lawyers develop for precisely these moments. The estate required restructuring to honor the foundational provisions. Equal distribution. As written by my grandfather. Cole, sitting across the table, did not speak for a long time. Then he looked at me. And for the first time in our lives, he looked at me the way you look at someone you have finally, completely seen. You were ready for this, he said quietly. I've been ready for a long time, I said. The signing took place on a Thursday morning. The room was smaller than my father's study, a conference room at Bernard's office, clean and neutral. Bernard sat at the head. Dad and Cole on one side. I sat on the other. The documents were placed in front of each of us in turn. Dad signed first. His hand was steady, expression composed, the face of a man who has accepted something difficult and chosen not to show it as pain. Cole signed second. He looked up at me before his pen touched the paper. I met his eyes. Neither of us spoke. I signed last. I did not feel the surge of triumph I might have imagined during those weeks of building the case. What I felt was quieter, more durable. The satisfaction of something restored rather than won, a correction made to a document that had held an error too long, finally set right. When the signing was complete, Bernard collected the pages and the room went still. My father looked at me across the table. Your mother would be proud, he said. I thought about the kitchen table. The tea. The hand squeeze. The words spoken to a 19-year-old who had not understood how much she would need them. I know, I said. 3 months have passed since that Thursday morning. The Harper Family Trust has been formally restructured. The estate is held equally between Cole and me, as our grandfather intended, because written words are the only kind that hold when tested. Cole and I have found something unexpected, a working relationship that is careful and awkward but genuinely functional. He has learned to ask questions before assuming. I have learned to answer without the armor I spent 34 years building. Dad has stepped back from Harper Family Holdings. He is quieter now. The stillness of a man who has stopped performing certainty he no longer possesses. I run the company now. As the named principal, with the title on the door and the authority in writing. I think about Mom often. The kitchen table. The tea. The hand squeeze. Her voice saying, document everything. She was not just teaching me to keep records. She was teaching me that being underestimated is only permanent if you allow it to become your own belief about yourself. I never did. And that, not the trust documents, not the legal review, not anything filed or signed, was the one thing no one in that family had the power to take from me.